They buried this story so deep it took nearly 3 centuries for the earth itself to give it back. 17 families, 43 men, women, and children, erased in a season of slaughter so precise, it looked like the work of a calculating God. And in a way it was, except this God wasn't divine. He was 11 years old. His name was Ezra Blackwell. You won't find that name in your history books, not under war heroes, not under criminals, not even in the colonial archives that catalogued every execution and every hanging. He exists only in fragments. A baptism record in Albany, a land transaction witnessed by men who later died under mysterious circumstances, and 3 militia reports, each stamped with the same cryptic notation, sealed by gubernatorial order. Officially, no such child existed in the Mohawk Valley in 1743. Unofficially, he was the invisible hand that lit the fires of a frontier war, and then sold both sides the means to keep it burning. To understand him, you must picture the valley as it was then, a jagged scar of settlement carved into the raw hide of wilderness. Dutch traders, Scottish farmers, German immigrants, clinging to their acres like castaways on a raft, always watching the tree line. On one side, British militias, desperate to hold their grip on the land. On the other, French forces, patient and relentless, pushing down from Canada with native allies who knew every bend of the river and every deer trail through the pines. Ezra learned early that war wasn't about flags or kings or faith. It was about leverage, fear in the right place, greed in the right place, and the right kind of silence. At 7, he spoke 3 languages, English, Dutch, and Mohawk, not as tricks for a prodigy, but as weapons. At 9, he could read an inventory sheet as quickly as he could read a man's desperation. At 11, he understood the one truth. No general would ever admit, the side that wins a war is the side that decides when not to end it. And so he began. Not with a musket, not with a knife, but with whispers. Whispers that traveled faster than any bullet and killed more surely than any blade. The winter of 1743 was long and brittle, the kind where the air itself feels like it might snap. Fort Hunter stood at the edge of the Mohawk Valley, its wooden palisade barely holding back the vast emptiness of forest and frozen river. Inside its stone trading house lived Ezra Blackwell, Ezra's father, a man whose reputation on the frontier wasn't built on loyalty, but on the speed with which he could turn blood into coin. Alistair's business was weapons, not in the clean, respectable sense of supplying one army under a contract, but in the dirtier, older way, where a musket could pass from a British officer's crate into a Mohawk warrior's hands by way of a single whispered deal. He called it trading. Others called it treason. Ezra absorbed it all like a pupil studying under a master sculptor, except his art was more precise. He saw that his father dealt in objects, but Ezra intended to deal in outcomes. One afternoon, a Mohawk interpreter named Raton Hanhake Ton arrived with news from the north. French captains were pressing for more fire sticks, specifically the kind with polished steel barrels and silver-banded stocks. Ezra noticed his father's eyes light with the thought of profit, but Ezra's mind was somewhere else entirely. He asked, almost idly, what if the British learned the French were getting those silver-banded muskets? Wouldn't they want to know where they came from? His father's eyes narrowed. That's not a question for children. But Ezra wasn't asking, he was planting. By the next week, Alistair was meeting secretly with British officers, offering intelligence for a price. And while his father thought he was the architect of this arrangement, Ezra had already begun his own parallel network, writing letters in 3 languages to militia captains, rival traders, and tribal war leaders. Not all the letters were truthful. Not all the Siams, natures were real, but every single one was designed to feed the same hidden furnace. What his father didn't see, what no one saw, was that Ezra wasn't choosing sides at all. He was building a loop of need, suspicion, and retaliation so tight that no faction could afford peace without losing everything. In war, people think they fight for victory. Ezra knew better. The real fight is to make sure the war never ends. The first time Ezra chose a family to destroy, it wasn't out of rage or rivalry. It was out of calculation. The Calder family lived 7 miles downriver from Fort Hunter, a prosperous Dutch household with good grazing land, a tidy stone farmhouse, and enough wealth to matter, but not enough political weight to shield themselves from danger. Willem Calder had been buying cattle from British merchants, and more dangerously, trading grain directly to French agents when the price was right. That small act, cutting out intermediaries like the Blackwells, was all Ezra needed to mark them for elimination. He visited under the guise of delivering a message from his father. Willem greeted him warmly. His wife Anna offered him tea. Ezra sat by the hearth, his small hands folded, eyes watching every flicker of emotion on their faces. "I overheard something yesterday," he said softly, as though afraid to speak. "The French captain who buys Papa's muskets. He said some farmers are hiding soldiers from British patrols. Papa told him it would bring trouble to innocent families." Willem's brow furrowed. "Which farmers?" Ezra lowered his eyes, adding just enough hesitation to make the lie breathe. "I wasn't supposed to hear names, but he mentioned Dutch families near the river." The seed was planted. In the days that followed, Willem began making quiet inquiries among his neighbors. Inquiries that made him look to the wrong ears, exactly like a man with something to hide. Ezra didn't stop there. Through a Huron intermediary, he passed word to a small war party that the Calder farm was being used to house British officers and store militia weapons. He even described the property in detail, the oak tree by the well, the barn with the red door, and claimed British scouts had already used Calder's information to capture and kill several Huron warriors. To the British, Ezra offered a forged letter, intercepted from French hands, naming the Calder farm as a supply point for French allied tribes. It was written in a child's flawless French script, laced with military terms no one suspected an 11-year-old could know. What Ezra had done was simple, but devastating. He gave each faction a different lie, tailored to their existing fears, then sat back to watch the inevitable collision, and collision was coming faster than anyone could stop it. The morning of March 18, 1743, broke unnaturally still. No wind, no bird calls, just the muffled groan of the river ice shifting in the distance. Ezra sat in his father's study, copying inventory lists in his sharp, deliberate hand, when he saw them. 12 Huron warriors moving along the tree line, their faces painted black for death. Almost at the same moment, from the opposite direction, a British patrol approached along the frozen road, muskets slung across their backs. Ezra didn't move. He didn't need to. The two forces were converging on the same destination, the Calder farm. By the time the first musket cracked, the trap had already closed. The Hurons, believing they'd find British officers hiding in the farmhouse, struck first, rushing the property and cutting down Willem Calder where he stood in the yard. Anna tried to reach their children, but a shot from the barn dropped her in the snow before she made it to the root cellar. The British patrol, thinking they were rescuing settlers from a French allied attack, opened fire on the Hurons without hesitation. In minutes, the scene dissolved into a screaming knot of smoke, blood, and splintered wood. Horses screamed. Children cried from the cellar until the roar of gunpowder drowned them out. Ezra stood at the edge of the trading post palisade, watching the distant flashes in the snow. No emotion touched his face, only a cold attentiveness, as if he were studying the results of a test. When the smoke cleared an hour later, the Calder farm was a blackened husk. Willem, Anna, their 3 children, 5 British soldiers, and 7 Huron warriors lay dead. None of them knew the war they died in had been scripted by an 11-year-old boy who never once touched a weapon. That night the frontier shifted. Dutch settlers, terrified of Indian raids, bought muskets from Ezra Blackwell at double their usual price. British officers, convinced of French infiltration among the Dutch, placed urgent orders for pistols and powder. Even French agents, hearing of British aggression, sought to arm their tribal allies for revenge. Ezra sat by the fire, recording the numbers in his private journal. 39 muskets sold, 17 pistols, 4 kegs of powder. The destruction of one family had fed 3 armies, and Ezra Blackwell had learned his first great truth: nothing sustains war like the careful killing of the right people at the right time. In the days after the Calder massacre, Ezra began cataloging not just sales, but reactions. He understood now that killing alone wasn't enough. The real power was in predictability, the ability to trigger fear in one group and know exactly which buttons it would push in another. He kept 2 ledgers. One was his father's, detailing musket shipments, powder weights, and payment in coin or trade. The other was his own, a secret book written in a tight coded script. In it he noted not the price of goods, but the price of events. Dutch farmer accused by British neighbors avoid him, increased tribal approach. British patrol lost men to Huron raid, demand for more scouts. Rumor of French spy militia drills, double frequency. Ezra didn't just observe patterns, he began creating them. A whisper here, a forged letter there, and entire settlements shifted their behavior without ever realizing they were responding to the same hand. One afternoon he overheard a German trader complaining about delays on a shipment from Albany. The man blamed Mohawk thieves. Ezra leaned against the doorway, head tilted, and asked in perfect German, "But what if it wasn't the Mohawks? What if someone wanted you to think it was?" By nightfall, that trader was telling every man in the fort that French-paid saboteurs were stealing goods and hiding among friendly tribes. 2 days later, a Mohawk runner arrived breathless, claiming British soldiers were planning to confiscate their winter stores in retaliation. Both sides prepared for conflict. Ezra didn't need to push them any further. Once the right suspicion was seeded, people watered it themselves. His father noticed the sudden acceleration in business, but misread it entirely. "War's heating up," Alistair told him one evening. "Mark my words, boy, this will be a bloody spring." Ezra only nodded. He didn't correct him, because too, the truth was far darker. War wasn't heating up. War was being fed, stroke by stroke, like a controlled fire, and Ezra Blackwell, 11 years old, had learned how to hold the bellows. By April of 1743, Ezra was ready to move beyond single blows. One family destroyed was useful, but it was only a spark. What he wanted now was a firestorm, something self-sustaining, where each side's reaction would automatically provoke the next. His opportunity came through a French trapper named Lucien Vauquelin, a man who had switched allegiances more times than he could count, and whose loyalty could be purchased in silver or liquor. Over mugs of rum at the fort's mess, Lucien mentioned a planned meeting between a French officer, a small Huron escort, and 2 Dutch grain merchants at a river crossing east of Canajoharie. Ezra's mind began mapping it instantly. To the British he sent an unsigned note, written in his careful, adult-like script, warning of French operatives smuggling powder under cover of grain trade. It included exact directions to the crossing and urged immediate action. To the Hurons, he sent word through a Mohawk intermediary that British scouts planned to ambush the French captain during a routine trade meeting, suggesting the Hurons should arrive early, hidden, and prepared to strike first. And to the Dutch merchants themselves, he delivered a forged message on French paper, claiming the meeting location had changed to avoid British eyes. But he left the original time and place intact. On April 11th, all 3 factions arrived within minutes of each other. The Dutch merchants, unarmed except for small pistols, stepped into the clearing expecting to see their French contact. Instead, they found themselves between a British patrol advancing from the west and Huron warriors erupting from the trees to the east. The first shot came from the Hurons. The British returned fire. The merchants fled toward the river, only to be cut down in the crossfire. Lucien Vauquelin, who was supposed to escort the French officer, escaped into the forest and swore later that he'd seen 5 different ambushes happen at once. The British lost 4 men. The Hurons lost 6. The merchants lost everything. And Ezra? He sat on the fort's roof that night, watching the glow of a burning supply barge drift down the Mohawk River. His father would sell weapons to all 3 sides before the week was over. Ezra wrote in his private ledger, 3 hands push 1 wheel, the wheel turns itself. Ezra had learned that real violence was costly. It burned through lives, resources, and plausible deniability. But what if fear could be conjured without any blade, bullet, or powder? What if panic alone could move men like pieces on a board? He decided to try. The village of Stoner's Landing, a small Dutch settlement along the river, had no direct stake in the French-British tensions. Its people were practical traders, farmers, and ferrymen, willing to do business with anyone who paid. Ezra's father had always considered them neutral soil, a place not to be disturbed. But neutrality, Ezra thought, was just another word for unclaimed territory. His plan began with sound. At night, he and 2 hired vagrants dragged lengths of iron chain across the old mill bridge, letting the links clatter and scrape against the wood. On other nights, they left carved sticks painted in crimson dye outside doorways with small tufts of deer hair tied to the ends. By the 3rd week, whispers of Huron scouts marking houses for slaughter began to ripple through the town. Ezra fed the story without ever being seen. He paid a half-drunk ferryman to claim he'd seen a French soldier in the tree line at dusk. He overpaid a mill worker to swear that her chickens had been killed and arranged in a spiral, a sign, she insisted, of a native curse. No attack came, no war party appeared, but by the month's end, the settlers of Stoner's Landing had armed themselves, built a crude palisade, and refused passage to any traveler they didn't know. Trade slowed, grain prices doubled, and in the panic, several families abandoned their farms altogether, leaving behind stored goods and tools Ezra's father acquired for pennies. The beauty of it, and Ezra savored this most of all, was that there was nothing to trace back to him. No one could accuse the boy of setting fire to a barn or killing egged livestock, when every incident had been explained by the fearful minds of the settlers themselves. He wrote in his ledger that night, "Fear without cause is the purest weapon. It consumes endlessly because the enemy it hunts cannot be killed." It was the first time Ezra realized he could create a war out of nothing at all. Ezra's father noticed the profits from Stoner's Landing but assumed they were coincidence, the natural spoils of instability, but someone else was watching with sharper eyes. Colonel Nathaniel Harrow was not a man given to coincidence. A decorated veteran of the Crown's colonial campaigns, he now operated in that gray zone between soldier and merchant, where influence was bought in whispers and empires were built not on muskets, but on manipulation. Harrow had come to the Hudson Valley under the pretense of mapping safe trade routes. In truth, he was measuring the ambitions and weaknesses of the men who controlled them. It was in the ramshackle tavern of Poughkeepsie that Harrow first heard the story. A boy, barely grown, who had managed to gut the economy of a thriving riverside settlement without lifting a weapon. The details were vague, passed from drunk to drunk, but Harrow could smell the truth under the embellishment. He arranged a meeting, not through direct summons, that would make the boy cautious, but through a chain of trades and favors that ensured Ezra would accidentally be delivering goods to an abandoned barn at dusk. When Ezra arrived, Harrow was waiting inside, standing like a statue in the pale light leaking through the roof slats. He didn't introduce himself. He simply asked, "How many men have you killed?" Ezra hesitated, sensing the trap. "None." "Good," Harrow replied, stepping forward so his boots echoed on the floorboards. "Killing is crude. It ends the usefulness of a man. Fear, however, fear makes him build your walls for you, grow your food for you, fight your enemies for you, and if you're clever," Harrow's voice lowered, "he will thank you for the privilege." Ezra felt the strange pull of the man's presence. Harrow wasn't praising him like his father did. He was claiming him, as if he already owned the boy's talents. "You have been playing with matches," Harrow said. "I can give you the tinderbox, but you'll have to burn bigger." Ezra didn't answer immediately. He just looked at the man and thought, this is what the next step feels like. The first instruction came in a single sentence, spoken as if it were a casual suggestion rather than an order. "Break Kingston, without touching a single man." Ezra knew Kingston well enough. A bustling port town on the Hudson, its lifeblood was not the crops of the surrounding farmlands, but the merchant contracts brokered at its docks. Ships came from New England, the Caribbean, even Europe. Its leaders believed themselves insulated from small-town intrigues. Harrow's challenge was clear: destroy that illusion. Ezra spent days walking Kingston's streets unnoticed, listening. The taverns held the real maps of the town. not of streets or rivers, but of gossip, debts, and grudges. He learned that the dockworkers despised the merchants for their arrogance. The merchants feared the farmers who could starve them with a single bad harvest, and everyone whispered about a fever that had killed 3 children in Albany the month before. The fever was real, but Ezra saw in it something larger: the perfect kindling. He began by paying a scribe to forge a letter, supposedly from a respected Kingston physician, warning that the fever had been seen in nearby hamlets. Copies of the letter were left where they would be accidentally found, in a church pew, under a dockworker's mug, on the counter of a grocer's shop. Next came the rumors, carefully planted in markets and on ferry rides. The fever spread through imported goods, perhaps through the very ships docking at Kingston's port. Within days, workers began refusing to unload cargo without inspection. Merchants raged at the delays, but when Harrow quietly arranged for a few crates to be confiscated and burned in the street, the panic became visible. The final blow was subtle. Ezra sent an anonymous note to the mayor, claiming that a rival town's traders had already begun quarantining Kingston vessels to protect themselves. Fear turned inward. Merchants accused dockworkers of sabotage. Farmers refused to enter the town. By the 3rd week, Kingston's proud harbor stood eerily still, ships anchored in silence, their goods rotting in the holds. No swords drawn, no blood spilled, yet the town was crippled. When Ezra returned to Harrow, the older man didn't smile. He simply placed a folded map on the table between them. "This," Harrow said, tapping the map, "is the first rung of the ladder. You've just learned how to climb." The map Harrow slid across the table was unlike any Ezra had seen before. Not a geographic chart, not even a merchant's trade route. It was a web. Lines connecting towns, symbols marking churches, taverns, mills, and people. Some of the symbols bore initials, others only a single cryptic mark: a raven, a key, a circle bisected by a diagonal slash. Ezra leaned closer. "What is this?" Harrow didn't answer immediately. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, the kind aged long enough to catch the lamplight like amber caught in stone. Only after Ezra took a sip did Harrow speak. "This," he said, "is the skeleton beneath the skin of this country." Ezra traced a line between 2 towns. The distance was modest, but the route passed through a third, marked with the raven. "And the symbols?" "Not places," Harrow said. "Influence. The men who carry whispers into crowded rooms. The women who decide which letters reach a desk and which find the fire. The dockmaster who can make a ship vanish from the ledger. The pastor who can stir his flock into fear or fury with the right sermon." Ezra's gaze swept over the network. It stretched beyond the Hudson Valley, into Boston, Philadelphia, even down to Charleston. "And you control them all?" Harrow's lips curved faintly. "Control is a crude word. I maintain the right pressures. Some serve out of loyalty, some out of debt, some out of fear. The method matters less than the result." Ezra felt the air shift, not in the room, but inside himself. The test in Kingston had been nothing more than a demonstration. Harrow hadn't wanted to see if Ezra could crush a town. He'd wanted to know if he could be trusted to touch a strand in this web without snapping it. "And where does this lead?" Ezra asked quietly. Harrow leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Up there," he said, tapping the top of the map. "They'll tell you the ladder is for climbing toward power. They're wrong. The real ladder descends, down into the dark, down where decisions are made before the world even knows they were needed." Ezra studied the web one last time. It no longer looked like lines and symbols. It looked like veins, carrying a black pulse through the body of a nation. Harrow folded the map, tucking it into his coat as though erasing an entire world with a single motion. The lamplight guttered, casting shadows across his face until it looked carved from something older than bone. "You've been given the courtesy of choice, Ezra," Harrow said. "Few men get that. Most simply wake one morning to find their leash has been fastened without their consent." Ezra didn't reply. His mind still clung to the web of influence he'd just seen, the way its threads reached everywhere, including places from his own past. Harrow placed a small envelope on the table. It was sealed with dark red wax, the imprint a circle with the diagonal slash he'd seen on the map. "Inside is a name," Harrow said. "A man you know." Ezra stared at the envelope, his pulse quickening. "What kind of task?" "The kind that removes you from the world you've known," Harrow said. "If you do it, you belong to the descent. If you refuse, you walk away, and the ladder will close behind you forever." Ezra picked up the envelope. The wax broke with a quiet snap. Inside, on a single slip of paper, was a name he hadn't spoken in years. Thomas Hale. A knot formed in his chest. Hale had been his only friend in those years before the war. The man who had helped him disappear after the skirmish in Saratoga. A man who, by all accounts, owed Ezra his life. "I won't kill him," Ezra said, the words low but firm. Harrow's gaze didn't waver. Who spoke of killing? Sometimes erasure takes subtler forms. A ledger altered, a letter intercepted, a truth whispered into the wrong ear at the right time. The result is the same. The man is removed from the board. Ezra felt something inside him shift, not toward agreement, but toward inevitability. Harrow wasn't asking for violence. He was asking for betrayal, the kind that rots a man from the inside. "You'll have until the moon wanes, Harrow said, rising. "When you return, I'll know by the look in your eyes whether you chose to descend or stay among the fools clinging to daylight." Ezra slipped the paper into his coat. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. He knew already, whether he acted or not, that Thomas Hale's name had marked the turning point of his life. The morning air was knife-cold when Ezra left the boarding house. The envelope with Hale's name was gone, burned to ash in the hearth before dawn, but the name itself burned hotter in his mind. Hale had last been seen in the port town of Carrick, running a modest shipping business out of a warehouse by the river. Ezra took the westward road, a rutted track that wound through fog-shrouded hills and silent hamlets where eyes followed strangers without welcome. By the second day he noticed them, the watchers. At first only silhouettes glimpsed in peripheral vision, a man in a wide-brimmed hat leaning against a fence, a woman lingering too long at a well. By the third day they no longer bothered to hide. Harrow's mark was on them, not ink or insignia, but the peculiar stillness, the way they regarded him like a ledger entry, already calculated. Carrick stank of salt and coal dust. The docks groaned under the weight of crates bound for places Ezra had never heard of. When he reached Hale's warehouse, the door hung open. Inside, dust motes drifted through pale light. The ledger on the desk was half-filled, the last entry dated nearly 2 weeks prior. Ezra questioned a dockhand stacking barrels. The man's gaze slid away, his voice low. "Hale's gone. Left sudden. No word where." It didn't sit right. Hale wasn't the kind to vanish. Ezra checked the boarding house records. Hale had paid for a month in advance, but never returned after the third day. A trunk, too heavy for one man to carry, had been removed by a pair of strangers. In the tavern, an old ship's captain leaned close, breath heavy with rum. "Your friend didn't leave," he murmured. "He was taken. Middle of the night. No one saw a thing. Or they saw too much." Ezra left the tavern with a cold certainty. Harrow's task was already in motion. Whether he carried it out or not no longer mattered. The descent, had begun without his consent, and Hale was caught in its teeth. As night fell, Ezra stood at the edge of the wharf, staring into the black water. Somewhere beyond the docks, a ship's bell tolled, slow and deliberate. He felt as though the sound was meant for him alone, a summons to a game already underway, where he was both pawn and executioner. The fog was thick enough to swallow sound when Ezra heard the footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, and too evenly spaced to belong to a drunk or a wanderer. He didn't turn. The docks had their own rules. Let the other man speak first. "You walk like a man who's already carrying a coffin in his mind," a voice said. Male. Deep, but tinged with an odd calm, like the owner had never once been surprised by the world. Ezra glanced over his shoulder. The man was tall, dressed in a seafarer's coat, but the brass buttons bore no emblem. His face was weathered, but his eyes, pale as winter glass, fixed on Ezra with the exactness of a surgeon deciding where to cut. "You're looking for Hale." It wasn't a question. "I can take you to him." Ezra studied him. "Why?" The man smiled thinly. "Because Harrow wants you to finish what you started, and because Hale is not where you think he is. He's somewhere far worse." A silence stretched between them, broken only by the water slapping against the pilings. "What do you want?" Ezra asked. The man's hand slipped into his coat, pulling out a small, folded piece of parchment. He held it between two fingers, careful not to let it touch the damp air. "There's a name written here. You will deliver this to the person it belongs to. No questions, no hesitation. When you have done that, I'll take you to Hale." Ezra didn't take the parchment. "And if I refuse?" The man's pale eyes sharpened. "Then you can wander Carrick until the sea takes your bones, and Hale will remain exactly where he is, which is to say, in a place most men pray they never wake up in." Ezra's instincts screamed trap, but the game was already tilted against him. Refusal would seal Hale's fate, perhaps his own. Acceptance would bind him tighter to Harrow's unseen machinery. Finally, Ezra took the folded parchment. It felt heavier than it should, as though the ink inside carried more than letters. The man gave a single satisfied nod. "You'll find the name at the northern edge of town," the stranger said, "but be quick. The night here has teeth." Then, without another word, he melted into the fog, leaving Ezra alone with the burden he had just agreed to carry. Ezra waited until the fog was so thick that even the lamps along the pier blurred into halos before he opened the parchment. He expected a name he did not recognize. What he found instead was a name he could never forget: Mara Keene. The ink was jagged as though written in haste, or in fury. For a moment his mind refused to bridge the distance between the letters and the woman they named. Mara, the girl who had once walked barefoot through the summer grass behind his father's house, her hair tangled with wind, her laughter unafraid. She had been the only one who saw him when everyone else looked past him. But Mara had vanished 5 years ago, vanished after the night Hale had come to him with a plan, after the night everything between them had rotted. His first thought was that she must be dead, and this was some cruel test. But then the second thought came, and it was worse. If Harrow's man had given him her name, it meant she was alive. And if she was alive, it meant she was inside Harrow's world. He read the name again, as though repetition might dissolve it. It did not. The northern edge of Carrick was no place for chance meetings. It was where the city bled into the marsh, where houses sagged under the weight of damp and time, where the air stank of stagnant water and old smoke. If Mara was there, she was either in hiding or being hidden. Ezra's boots sank into the soft mud as he made his way up the narrow causeway, the lantern swinging at his side. Every shadow looked like it might step forward, every sound felt deliberate. When he reached the last row of leaning shacks, he saw her. Standing in the doorway, a dim light behind her, she looked smaller than he remembered. Her hair was darker now, her eyes older, but the way she held herself, defiant, as though daring the world to push her 1 inch too far, was the same. She saw him, and for a moment, there was no recognition. Then it came quick and sharp, and with it, something like fear. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. Ezra's reply was swallowed by the night, because behind her, deeper in the gloom, he saw another shape moving. Someone else was listening. The second figure stepped forward, and the lantern light caught only fragments: the edge of a cheekbone, a gloved hand, the dull gleam of a pistol barrel. Whoever they were, they didn't speak, but their stillness was more threatening than any shouted warning. Mara's gaze flicked between Ezra and the shadow behind her. "Inside," she said, her voice low but urgent. The shack's interior was smaller than Ezra expected. The walls bowed from years of damp. A single table sat in the middle, littered with yellowed maps and torn scraps of newspaper. He noticed the floorboards near the hearth were newer than the rest. The armed figure lingered in the corner, watching. Ezra ignored them, fixing his attention on Mara. "You disappeared," he said, "and now Harrow's people are passing your name to me like a command." Her eyes tightened. "It is a command. He's been looking for me. For 5 years." Ezra's voice dropped. "Why?" She hesitated, and for a moment he thought she might lie. But then her shoulders sank, and the defiance in her face shifted into something heavier. "Because I'm the last one who knows what he did. The night of the fire, when the warehouse burned, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a debt dispute. Harrow set it himself, and the people inside." She stopped, her voice fraying. "They weren't supposed to be there, but they were. All of them." Ezra's mind twisted back to the reports from that night. 9 dead, none identified publicly, whispers of children in the upper rooms. "And you saw it?" "I saw him lock the doors," she said, "and then I saw him smile when the flames caught." The armed figure shifted, and for the first time Ezra caught their eyes, cold, watchful, like they'd been given orders not to let her speak too much. "Why tell me now?" he asked. Mara leaned in, her voice a knife's edge. "Because Harrow's not just cleaning up the past anymore. He's building something bigger than the city, and the people he's taking now." She swallowed hard. "They won't be found in any report, not unless you stop him." The floorboard near the hearth creaked. The armed figure's hand tightened on the pistol. Ezra realized then, Mara wasn't free here. She was already caught. Ezra's gaze darted to the corner again, to the silent figure with the pistol. They weren't guarding the shack from outsiders. They were guarding Mara from leaving. "You're not here by choice," he said. Mara's lips trembled, but she didn't answer. Instead, her eyes cut toward the window, the smallest twitch, a warning. Ezra followed her glance. Out beyond the warped glass, through the night haze, he saw faint movement. Figures, at least 3, spaced wide, moving slow. Harrow's men. He turned back to Mara, lowering his voice to a whisper meant for her alone. "They're here." "I know," she murmured. "They've been circling for days. Tonight they'll move, and if they take me—" Her breath caught. "No one will hear from me again." Ezra's pulse thudded in his ears. He shifted slightly, testing the floorboard beneath him. It creaked loud enough to make the armed figure's head snap up. No sudden moves. Not yet. He tried to buy time. "You think I can stop Harrow? That I can take this to anyone who'd listen?" Mara's voice sharpened, like she needed him to understand. "It's not about who listens. It's about who acts before it's too late. There's something under the hearth." The guard stiffened at the word hearth. Ezra kept his expression flat, but his mind locked onto the newer planks he'd noticed earlier. Evidence. Proof. The first tap came from outside. A low, deliberate knock against the shack's siding. Not a request to come in, but a signal. The guard moved toward the door. Mara's breath quickened. Ezra's hand brushed his coat pocket, feeling the cold steel of the small revolver he'd brought but hadn't yet shown. He leaned close to her ear. "When they open that door, move toward the back wall. No matter what happens." Her eyes widened, but she nodded. The guard's hand touched the latch. Outside, boots crunched closer in the frost. Ezra felt the moment snap taut, the fraction of a second before things spiraled beyond control. The latch clicked. Ezra drew. The door swung inward. Frosted air swept in with it, carrying the stink of damp earth and unwashed wool. 2 men stepped through, thick coats, low hats, rifles cradled in their arms. Harrow's dogs. The kind of men who didn't speak unless it was to give an order or confirm a kill. The guard inside turned to greet them, and that was the only opening Ezra would get. His revolver cleared his coat in a single motion. The first shot cracked the silence apart, deafening in the cramped space. The guard folded sideways, clutching his side, his weapon clattering across the floorboards. The newcomers reacted instantly. One swung his rifle up, the barrel glinting in the lantern light. Ezra dove left, shoulders smashing into the table, sending the single oil lamp teetering. Shadows lunged up the walls. Mara dropped flat, her hands over her head. The second man fired. The shot split the air where Ezra's head had been an instant earlier, splintering the back wall. Ezra rolled, sighted, and pulled the trigger again. The nearer man screamed, a high animal sound, collapsing with his rifle sliding from his grasp. But the third, the one still outside, had seen enough. His shadow loomed at the threshold, and then the muzzle of his weapon appeared. Ezra lunged forward, slamming his shoulder into the doorframe. The gun discharged with a blinding flash, the round chewing a hole through the far wall. Ezra wrenched the rifle from the man's grip, the two of them locked in a primal, breathless struggle, boots skidding on the warped boards. He felt the man's hot breath, heard the low growl in his throat. Ezra drove an elbow into his jaw, once, twice, until the grip loosened. He didn't wait to see if the man would fall. He grabbed Mara by the wrist. Now. She hesitated only long enough to snatch something from the hearth, a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Then they were moving, shoving, through the open doorway into the night. Behind them, the shack roared with chaos, groans, curses, the ringing echo of spent gunfire. Ahead, only darkness, the crunch of frozen ground underfoot, and the knowledge that Harrow would not let this stand. The night swallowed them whole. No moon, no stars, only the thin breath of wind skimming across the snow-crusted fields. Ezra's boots crunched with each step, the sound sharp as glass in the silence. He kept Mara close, his hand firm around hers. She was breathing hard, her steps uneven. He slowed them just enough to keep her upright. Speed meant nothing if she collapsed. They moved without speaking, navigating by memory and instinct. The shack was far behind them now, but Ezra knew Harrow's men were not the type to lick their wounds. Wounded dogs bite harder. Somewhere in the distance, faint and muffled, came the sound. A single deliberate crack of ice underfoot. Not theirs. Ezra froze. Mara felt the sudden stillness in him and stopped too. Her breath hung in the cold air between them. He didn't turn to look. Looking would only tell them where his eyes were pointed. Instead, he listened. The wind shifted, carrying the faint jingle of metal. Harness buckles? No. Too light. Likely the swing of a rifle strap. Ezra's stomach sank. Harrow's men were tracking them on foot. He leaned close to Mara's ear. They're following. She stiffened, clutching the cloth-wrapped bundle tighter. He tugged her forward, changing direction sharply, angling toward the black outline of a tree line. The cover would buy them time, but it was a gamble. Deep snow lay under those branches, and every step would slow them. The sounds behind them grew clearer, a low murmur of voices, the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who believed they already had their prey. Ezra's mind worked furiously. He counted the rounds left in his revolver. 3. Not enough for a clean fight, not enough for mistakes. Mara stumbled again, catching herself with one hand in the snow. He pulled her up, but her eyes weren't on him. They were locked on something over his shoulder. "Ezra," she whispered, voicing, trembling. "There's more than two." The cold deepened. The shadows behind them moved. 3 shapes now, maybe 4, fanning out across the field. And then came the whistle, sharp, high, and answered from somewhere far to the left. They weren't just being followed, they were being herded. The whistle still echoed when the first shot split the night. It wasn't aimed to kill. Ezra could tell by the way the bullet hissed past his ear and vanished into the dark. It was meant to drive them forward, herding, just like he feared. "Mara, run!" She didn't hesitate. The two of them plunged into the open stretch of snow, the tree line a black wall in the distance. The ground was uneven, drifted deep in places, and every step felt like running through water. Another shot. This one closer. A spray of ice and powder burst just inches from Mara's boots. Ezra resisted the urge to fire back. 3 bullets. That was all he had. Wasting them in blind panic would be suicide. The voices behind them were growing louder, the crunch of boots faster now. The men were confident, certain their prey had nowhere to go. The tree line loomed larger, shadows shifted between the trunks, and for a sickening heartbeat, Ezra thought Harrow's men had circled ahead. But no, it was only the wind stirring the lower branches. Then a 3rd shot cracked, and Mara stumbled hard, crying out. Ezra's heart stopped. He caught her under the arm, pulling her upright, scanning for blood. None. The bullet had torn through her coat, grazing her side. "They're trying to slow us," he growled. The snow thinned as they neared the trees, the ground firmer, but the danger doubled. The dark here was absolute, perfect for an ambush. Ezra pulled the revolver from his coat. The cold steel bit into his palm. He forced himself to breathe steady. 2 shots to break pursuit, 1 left for whatever waited ahead. The next bullet came from the left, not behind. It struck a branch above his head, showering them with splinters. He didn't think. He fired twice into the dark where the flash had come from. A muffled curse answered. Someone was hit. "Mara, move!" They reached the first line of trees. The fire shapes swallowed in shadow. Behind them, the shouts turned angry. Ezra knew they had seconds, maybe less, before the chase bled into the forest. And in the darkness ahead, something moved. Not a man. Something heavier. Ezra froze mid-stride, his grip tightening on Mara's arm. There, just ahead between the trunks, a shift in the dark. Too large to be a man, too still to be the wind. Mara felt it too. She stopped breathing. The cold air carried a faint, strange scent. Metallic, but not like blood. More like iron left to rust in the rain, sharp and sour on the tongue. Behind them, the pursuers crashed into the snowfield, their boots thundering closer. Voices barked orders, but Ezra couldn't make out the words. They sounded muffled now, as if the forest itself was swallowing the sound. Something moved again. A soft thud, then another, measured and heavy, like it was circling. Ezra's mind flipped through possibilities. Bear, elk, maybe a lone wolf. But none of those moved like this. He angled Mara behind him, gun raised. 1 bullet left. The thing stopped. Total silence settled over the trees. Even the wind had gone still. Ezra strained his ears, and that's when he heard it. A slow, deliberate inhale. Whatever it was smelling them. The men chasing them were only 30 yards back now, their lantern beams slicing through the first rows of trees. They hadn't seen it yet. A deep crack came from their left. A branch thick as an arm, splintering under weight. Mara whispered, "Ezra, we can't go forward." He didn't answer. If they turned back, Harrow's men would have them in seconds. If they went forward, they might not come back at all. Then, movement to the right. Fast. Ezra pivoted, heart pounding, catching a flicker of pale in the darkness. Not fur, not flesh, something smoother. The men behind them shouted suddenly, panic in their voices. One fired his rifle, the shot echoing madly between the trunks. Ezra didn't see what they were shooting at. He didn't want to. He grabbed Mara's wrist. "We move, now." Whatever waited in that darkness, they were about to run straight into it. The snow crunched beneath their boots as Ezra dragged Mara forward, weaving through the narrow gaps between the black pines. Behind them, Harrow's men screamed, not the battle cries of armed hunters. These were raw, unguarded screams, the kind that tore through a man when something inside him shattered. Ezra risked a glance over his shoulder. Lanterns swayed wildly, beams slashing across trunks, before one dropped into the snow and went out. Then another scream, cut short. A sound followed, wet and quick, like cloth tearing under water. Mara clutched his coat. "Ezra!" "Don't look." The night came alive with running. Not human footsteps, but something larger, faster, circling the chaos. Ezra caught shadows darting through the gaps, always just out of reach of the light. A shot rang out, then another, the muzzle flashes revealing glimpses. A shape low to the ground but long, like it could stretch itself. The snow sprayed in arcs as it moved, impossibly fast, doubling back before the eye could track it. One man broke from the group, sprinting after Ezra and Mara, his eyes wide, face pale. He didn't make it 5 yards before something caught him. Ezra didn't see claws, didn't see teeth, only saw him lifted, yanked backward into the dark, like the night itself had reached out and taken him. His scream cut short with a sharp, bone-snapping crack. Silence fell again, broken only by the hiss of falling snow from the branches. Ezra and Mara kept moving, hearts pounding, until the light from the last lantern faded behind them. They were alone now, or so it seemed. A whisper of breath brushed the back of Ezra's neck. He spun. Nothing there. But the snow behind them was disturbed, marked by something far too wide to be human footprints and far too deep to belong to any animal Ezra knew. Dawn crept slowly over the horizon, bleeding cold gray light into the forest. Ezra and Mara pressed deeper into the trees, every step heavy with dread. The creature had not revealed itself fully, but its shadow lingered in every sound, the snap of a branch, the whisper of wind, the distant crack of ice. They came to a frozen creek, the brittle ice reflecting their pale faces. Mara's hands trembled as she unwrapped the cloth bundle from her coat. Inside lay scraps of torn documents, maps, letters, fragments of Harrow's designs, proof that the rot ran far deeper than Ezra had imagined. A sudden snap echoed behind them. Ezra whipped around, revolver raised, heart hammering. But there was nothing, only the empty forest, silent and watching. "Ezra," Mara whispered, voice strained. "It's waiting." He nodded, jaw tight. Whatever it was patient. A predator that thrived in shadows and silence, feeding on fear. They moved again, each step a promise not to surrender, not to become another whisper lost in these woods. The forest held its breath. The final act was near. The truth you followed through this darkness is no story. It's a warning. Harrow's reach is not just the shadow over Ezra and Mara, it is the rot in every institution built to protect us, the lies whispered in boardrooms, the veiled threats behind closed doors, the silent manipulation that bends reality without us knowing. The creature in the woods is no mere beast. It is the embodiment of that corruption, ancient, relentless, invisible until it strikes. Ezra's fight is your fight. His survival is not luck. It is the spark of defiance against a world designed to keep you blind, compliant, silent. If you have listened this far, if this truth has cut through your defenses, comment now, twice. I see through the shadows. I walk unafraid. Say it. Own it. Because the knowledge you hold changes you. It fractures the mask. It awakens the part of you too long asleep. You are no longer a pawn. You are the player. This is the path few dare to walk, but once you step, there is no turning back. The darkness is real. The puppet masters pull their strings, but now you see the strings, and with that vision you hold power. Remember this moment. Let it mark you, because the war for your soul has only just begun.